profit the firms are earning, it'll encourage more firms to enter that industry. They see there's money to be made, so they're going to take advantage of that. So in the long run, they're going to compete down this economic profit all the way down to zero. At that point, there's going to be no incentive for new firms to enter the market and begin, selling goods in this industry. And remember that this economic profit includes opportunity costs, so money that could be made elsewhere. So if firms are earning an economic loss, that means even they could be earning an accounting profit. Their revenues could be greater than their costs. What that's saying is they can make more money in another industry. So they use those resources in a different way. So if there's economic loss, if firms are earning an economic loss in the industry, we're going to see firms exit the market and they're going to go into other industries. And they'll begin selling goods or services in that industry. They'll do that all the way up until, again, we reach this break-even point, where the average firm is breaking even. Okay, yeah, we ended by talking about the long-run supply curves. Basically, what's going to happen is if there's an increase in demand, what that's going to do is end up increasing the price initially. So we move, and we're looking at the overall market, increase demand from this curve here, D1 to D2. So we're going to increase the price. What that's going to do is cause firms to have an economic profit. Again, the price is now higher than it was before. So it's going to attract new firms to the industry. And that'll end up increasing the supply and then driving the price back down to $2. So in the long run, our supply curve is going to be at this equilibrium price. So we have the short run supply curve here, S1 and S2. The long run is going to be where the short run supply crosses the demand curve. So it'll be horizontal there because anytime the price is going above that, we're seeing new firms enter. If the price goes below that, we'll see firms leave. And it'll bring that price right back, the initial equilibrium price. Okay, so when there's easy entry into a market, it's going to be difficult to have profits in the long run. So we talked about this kind of in theory. Here's an example of it with iPhones. So originally, when the first iPhone came out, firms, or I guess people who made apps, were able to charge for them. So they could charge, $4 or $5 for a download because these were new things. But very easy to create an app. Very small companies, like 3-4 people, could make their own app and get in there. So over time, we see more and more apps being created because it's so easy, and it's competing the price down. So originally, mid-2008, people are paying for apps up to $5. Well, by 2010, no one's paying for apps. They're only downloading apps for free. And within that first year, there were 25,000 apps available in the iTunes store. So again, with this very low cost, anyone with programming skills can get into creating apps, and it's going to compete away this profit all the way down to nothing. So the ability to get rich on an app was the cultural idea was a meme for a couple years, but it soon faded because people weren't able to, because there were just so many apps out there. Anyone could enter the market and begin competing. I want to end this chapter with looking at some of the problems of perfect competition. Oftentimes, economists look at perfect competition as basically the highest quality market that has, in their mind, the greatest amount of competition. Now, all models abstract from reality, but perfect competition really suffers from this. So obviously, we need assumptions to make working with models possible, or else we might as well just look at the real world. So we have to assume away some of the difficulties of the real world. So we can focus on, let's say, if we're looking at 2 or 3 variables, we want to understand how one affects the other. We need to hold all these other things constant, so we just assume they're not going to change. But obviously, that's not always going to be the case. So it's important to remember that these models that we use are a tool. They help improve our understanding of the world, but it's not a perfect representation of it. There's a lot of problems with perfect competition. Economist Teacher McCluskey likes to joke that if you find a new way that these assumptions don't hold in the real world, all you have to do is write a couple papers on it and you get your Nobel Prize. And she lists something like 100 ways that the world doesn't hold up to the idea of perfect competition. So can you guys describe what actual competition is within this model of perfect competition? So I talked about new companies entering when you see these economic profits. So that's basically what competition is. It's new firms entering and charging a lower price, bringing the price down to the market equilibrium. Or bringing it up to the market equilibrium, depending on whether your firm's entering or the firm's exiting. Does this look like competition in the real world? Is that what Ford and GM does to each other? Is that what different restaurants do to each other? No, there's a lot of different ways that firms engage in competition with each other, besides just entering the industry and beginning competing, or offering a product that's exactly the same as another company's. So under this idea of perfect competition, this real competition is going to end once we reach equilibrium. At that point, we've exhausted all the opportunity we have to engage in competition, so we're not going to see any more of it. So really, it's the absence of competition, which is considered the pinnacle of a perfectly competitive model, which is very different from the real world. And it kind of implies that the existence of competition is evidence of some sort of inefficiency. So the only time the competition can take place in the perfectly competitive model is when the price being charged is too high, when there's this economic profit present that needs to be competed away. Now, if we're just learning about this, you write it on an exam and that's it, we never think about perfect competition again, then this wouldn't be a problem. But when we hold up perfect competition as the ideal market, and we analyze markets and how well they're operating based on whether they meet perfect competition or not, then it causes problems. And oftentimes, people use the idea of perfect competition. They take this model and use it as an example and a way to test for whether there's a monopoly, and whether we should use antitrust legislation to break up firms or somehow, increase competition through those methods. So this has real implications if we're going to be using it, which some people do. Like I said, competition in this model is basically just firms lowering prices and entering and offering the same exact good as someone else. But it's hard to justify that looking at the real world. And one of the problems with economics, trying to teach it or trying to learn it, is that so many of these models assume away things we see in the real world that it becomes difficult to try to look at the real world for examples. So if you try to look at how actual firms behave through the lens of perfect competition, through this model, it'll be pretty difficult to understand what's going on. So it makes it seem much more difficult to understand. I know when I was an undergrad, I understood what supply and demand was. Like one of my friends said that when he first learned that, he's like, "Oh, this makes sense. This is so awesome." And that's why he wanted to study economics. And it wasn't that eye-opening for me. It took me several years. I was literally just about to graduate when I finally really understood the power of it, because I went to a talk where an economist talked about how supply and demand is constantly changing, how these curves are constantly shifting as we discover new knowledge and as things change. And I could see that happening in the real world, unlike just the static supply and demand curve. So it's the same thing with the perfectly competitive markets. Very difficult to get an example of this when you're looking at how real firms operate. And that's because of the assumptions of the model. It's not because, this is something that's hard to learn. So there's a lot of forms of competition besides competing on, entering an industry and slightly lowering the price of the goods. So there's a lot of other ways that we can do this. The first one is quality. Obviously, firms can offer a super high quality good. They can do something to make it stand out. Maybe they're more reliable, fewer repairs, or maybe it's easier to repair. If it's like a car, you can get the parts for it anywhere. Maybe they make it simple to fix yourself. Maybe they have a warranty, or they guarantee they're going to replace it if there is a problem. Firms use advertising to try to differentiate their product. So they try to show off their different features, give you more information about how the product actually works, what it can actually do for you. They can tie other goods to that perfectly competitive good. So instead of purchasing just that good that's identical to everything else, they can give you some other product or some other service that no other firms offer. There's also this idea of brand name capital, where firms develop a reputation over time so that people know to go to them to meet a certain need, and that need's going to be met by them and not other companies. And that could be whether it's high quality, whether it's reliability, whether it's super cheap or super quick, all these different things that get attached to a brand name. You guys think of any examples of these like 4 different ways, or maybe another way that firms engage in competition with each other? One of the easiest examples that comes to my mind is like the tying other goods to a perfectly competitive good. Think of sheets. Like obviously gas is going to be a perfectly competitive good. There's no difference between gas stations and like the gas you're getting. But Sheetz offers a lot of other things. So people don't just go to Sheetz to get the gasoline. They'll stop there and get gas, like when they're on a road trip. Also go inside, they have super clean bathrooms. They've got a huge made-to-order menu. They offer a ton of different drinks and stuff there. Now they're selling beer there. There's a lot of other things you could get that's like high quality, that they have some sort of market power at, that they're able to differentiate. So they tie this good, this gasoline, which is the same everywhere, with this other stuff that you can only get at Sheetz. Is there any other examples of competing on quality or advertising, or using brand name capital? All right, what's a brand you would shop at that like you buy from them, but you wouldn't buy from anyone else? Like people who swear by Nikes and won't like buy any other sneakers. Apple? Yeah, a lot of people will purchase from Apple and refuse to buy an Android. They've developed this brand name capital over time. So what do you think when you think of Apple? Is it high quality, or they're like, what, I don't know, the number of apps you can use, or like easy interface?
There hasn't, you don't have the green text.
We'll talk about that in the next chapter. Not about green text in general, but everyone else using it. That definitely makes goods more valuable when other people are using it, and we can tie like their usage together. It's no good to have a fax machine if you're the only fax machine in the world. Not that anyone uses fax machines anymore. Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that firms can differentiate their product, that you end up competing with each other, or they end up competing with each other, besides just offering it the same exact good at a slightly lower price. So consumers have tons of different needs, and if all products were identical like we had in perfect competition, then it would actually make them worse off, because we have all these people without needs being met. So even though it's held up this ideal as like the best, the most competition, the most robust, it wouldn't make people as well off as where you have all these different firms offering all these different products. And it's this idea that there's unmet needs out there, that consumers can be made better off, they're offered a product that met their needs better, that causes differentiation, causes competition. And this is the real thing we want to understand when we're looking at the economy, not just minimizing average total cost. So firms can improve their sales, earn a profit by offering new goods that meet previously unmet consumer needs. So the reason the original iPhone was such a big deal, and why people offering or describing their new products get up on a stage in a black turtleneck and talk about it, is because of the original iPhone. It was such a big deal when Steve Jobs got up there and explained to people this brand new concept, this brand new phone that nothing No other product in the past had those sort of characteristics. This is much more important. These entrepreneurs coming up with new ideas, far more important than minimizing average total cost. Real-world markets are compared to the ideal perfect competition, despite the many assumptions. But all these assumptions assume away this competition, the things we're trying to understand. So it assumes that products have been developed in all relevant details. So it means there's no way to improve these products. You can't change any of their characteristics. You can't make them better and meet consumer needs anymore. In some cases, this could be true. Hard to imagine making like a better gasoline. But for a lot of other products, most other products, this isn't the case. There's ways to improve their quality, to change them slightly to meet different needs that people have, things like that. It assumes that firms never compete for consumers by improving quality or somehow changing the features of their products. But we know this isn't true. If you go to the store and there's several different options of the same product there, you're going to compare quality. And you're going to notice that firms offer them many different qualities. It assumes that each firm in the industry produces outputs that are identical in consumers' minds. But we know that's not true. People look at different firms differently. They develop this brand name capital, so they're noted for something. Whether it's Subaru, their cars are more rugged and they last longer, they're more dependable, versus other cars that may be lower cost. Other cars that may be easy to fix. All these different ideas we have about companies. And there's more. It assumes that there's such a large number of firms that no firm has any control over their pricing, that they're unable to choose where they price these goods and services. It assumes that if the firm tries to charge any higher of a price, it's going to make zero sales. There's usually not that many firms in an industry. The perfect competition, we're assuming a lot of firms, like hundreds and hundreds of firms. And even if there were that many firms, we wouldn't expect to see that if they increase their prices to go to zero sales. We'd expect there to still be some people who would be willing to purchase from them, just because they don't know about other firms offering these at lower prices. Maybe it's more difficult to get them. Maybe they developed a relationship with that firm that's selling it, and now they trust them more than they trust other firms. So they're willing to pay that little bit of extra price. It assumes that both producers and consumers are fully informed about all the products in the market. And it also assumes that producers know the most efficient means of producing and distributing those outputs. And we know that both producers and consumers suffer from a lack of knowledge in markets. As consumers, we don't know before we purchase a product if it's going to fully meet our needs, if we have this full understanding of what it's going to be like. It's only after we begin using it that we understand quite how good it is. For some industries, that's not a big deal. If you buy meat at the grocery store, it's usually going to vary in quality a little bit, or vary in size a little bit, maybe freshness a little bit, but it's not that big of a deal. But if you try to buy a used car, very difficult to know what you're walking into and how good that car is going to be. And finally, we assume that firms enter and leave each perfectly competitive industry pretty much instantaneously. So once they decide to begin competing in this industry, they immediately jump in and begin competing. Once they start earning a loss, they leave the industry. And it's just that simple. But in the real world, it's not. You end up with workers that develop skills in producing these certain goods or services. Very difficult for them to transition to something else. And the capital equipment you have is typically suited to just making one good, a very narrow range of goods. So repurposing that or selling that and trying to buy new equipment, it takes time and it takes money. So these are all the ways in which perfectly competitive markets, this model that we have, ends up failing for the real world. So even though this is very useful, and we can take the lessons, it's important to understand the implications of this, it still doesn't do a great job of describing the real world. Remember, real entrepreneurship is a constant process of risk-taking and making improvements to the current products being offered, whether it's improving the products themselves or the production methods to make it cheaper so people can get goods at a lower cost. And this is both incremental changes, little small tweaks, and revolutionary new ideas. Both of these fall under the umbrella of entrepreneurship. The constant process of entrepreneurial successes and failures, things that use profit and loss as a filtering mechanism, so the successful ones earn a profit. Firms are encouraged to keep producing it. Other firms are encouraged to begin offering similar products. And loss signals to these firms that the product they're offering doesn't meet consumer needs. Consumers don't actually want it at that price. It filters out those losers. This has no place in the model of perfect competition. Consumers' tastes change all the time. Entrepreneurs have new discoveries of how to meet these old needs or new needs that haven't been met yet. So if you remember the example of hard seltzers we talked about in the beginning of class, there's no way to account for this in the model of perfect competition. There's no new idea to come up with this new product. There's no profit mechanism encouraging firms to enter this market and they begin trying to differentiate themselves. So you notice they all don't offer the same exact type of seltzer. They all have different flavors, different like sugar content based off what brand you're buying from. So there's a lot of differences between these. So they're differentiating even though they're entering this industry and competing against each other. And there's a lot of different prices for these goods too. So we'll end with Harold Demsetz. He has a quote on perfect competition. Calls it the central model of neoclassical economics, but doesn't really involve competitive pricing activity. So the equilibrium market clearing price that emerges from this model, it might be termed a competitive price, but it results from this mysterious market clearing forces and not the competitive pricing activities of firms. They're not actually competing against each other, trying to lower their costs, trying to lower their price, or trying to differentiate and price higher. So it's not truly perfect competition. He says it's more or less than the undertaking of profitable imitation of output responses to giving market prices. So rather than competition, it's just firms seeing what other firms are doing and then doing the exact same thing, which is something we don't see very often in the real world. Even when we have these new firms seeing that White Claws and Trulies are taking off, wanting to offer their own hard seltzer, we see them doing it in different ways. The actual seltzers that they're putting out there are going to be different than the original hard seltzers in that market. And they're usually priced somewhat differently. So even this imitation isn't perfect imitation. That brings us to the end of perfect competition. Again, there's a lot of useful stuff in this model of perfect competition. There's a lot of ways it doesn't fit the real world. So this class I wanted to hammer home on the ways it doesn't fit the real world. So you guys don't try to, like when you're studying for the exam or thinking through this, try to look for examples in the real world and not see anything match up to it. That makes it that much more difficult to understand when you're trying to match this pattern to something else and you're unable to find it. So if you guys have any questions about perfect competition, we've talked about so far in this chapter, or anything we've talked about today regarding it. All right. So let's end class by starting the next chapter on monopoly and antitrust policy. So this monopoly market structure, what you basically have is one firm as the only seller of a good or service. So this is the complete opposite of perfect competition. Instead of a ton of firms offering the same product, you've got one firm and no one else offers anything like it. So there's two reasons to study monopoly. The first is that some firms truly are monopolists. You have a market that is a monopoly. So we want to understand how these firms behave, what's going on in those markets. The other option is that firms might collude in order to act like a monopolist. So if we know how monopolies operate, we know what's going on with monopolies, we understand them, it helps us identify these firms. So for example, OPEC, the oil producing cartel of a lot of Middle East countries and a few other countries outside the Middle East, they collude together and act like a monopolist. So they restrict their output in order to have higher per unit cost. And later on, we'll look at some diagrams to understand exactly how that takes place. But basic idea, they increase the price and they lower output. So we know what a monopoly is, how they function. We can see when firms collude together and do this. So we get evidence of that. If you've ever played the game Monopoly, very accurately named, the goal of the game is to own everything. Be the only one offering, you own the property. So I guess like technically you're the renter, you're the landlord. So the goal is to have a monopoly on the board to own all those places. Same basic idea here, where you're the only one in the industry offering this type of product. So up until a couple years ago, Loretta had one pizza shop. The only place you could buy pizza was at MVP. Now we got the new place that opened up in town. I haven't been there yet. Have you, any of you guys? Is it any good? I guess. Dimitri, yeah.
Yeah, that's all right. Very good.
All right. I was curious. I still haven't been there yet.
That sounds pretty good.
That's good to know. Well, you could think, well, you said Dimitri's?
Yeah.
Dimitri's is a monopoly. It's the only pizza place in town. But is that really true? Because we have competition from Frankie's, LPG, Torvian, Spanky's when it's open. They offer some similar food. And it's competition from places like Smith Myers or like Walmart in Evansburg. That give you, you can buy frozen pizzas you cook at home. So if you think these alternatives, you think going to Frankie's, LPG, Tord, or buying this from Smith Myers or Walmart are close substitutes to MVP's pizza or to Dimitri's pizza, then it's not a monopoly. They don't have a monopoly because you can get these similar goods elsewhere. But if you don't consider these alternatives to be close substitutes for Dimitri's pizza, then Dimitri's is a monopoly. So basically, Dimitri's unique position is the only devoted pizza place in Loretto. It's a nearby area. Gives it some market power. So they have some monopoly power to raise prices and obtain economic profit. How much market power they have depends on whether you consider these alternatives good substitutes or not. Their textbook uses NCAA as an example of monopoly. NCAA started out of a meeting Teddy Roosevelt had with a bunch of college presidents. It was one year when he was president, so like early 1900s. I think 18 college football players were killed during games. So he said he was going to ban football if they didn't change the rules to somehow make it more safe. What's that? That was back when they had the flying wedge. So they would literally have the guy with the ball in the middle, surround them with blockers, and they would just trample the other team. Out of this meeting grew the NCAA, and now it governs college athletics. A lot of athletes in here, so I don't think I have to explain to you what the NCAA is. Some economists, like Robert Barrow, claim that the NCAA is basically a monopoly. And they use their monopoly power to basically eliminate what student athletes can receive from their efforts, including banning selling your image and likeness. That's the one that's nuts to me. I understand not wanting to pay, so big colleges can afford to just recruit and turn it into a business. Make it very hard for St. Francis to ever recruit anyone. But the fact that you can't get any money from signing autographs, in my mind is nuts. So over the years, we've seen a lot of antitrust lawsuits that have been brought against NCAA. And some of them have worked, they've chiseled away at the monopoly. So there's greater television access, sometimes you get stipends for student athletes, but they still largely have this monopoly power. If you want to play college sports, you basically have to go through the NCAA. You have to abide by their rules. So where do monopolies come from? For a firm to be a monopoly, there has to be barriers to entry that prevent other firms from entering the market and even competing against them, offering similar products. So again, in perfect competition, we had no barriers to entry. In monopoly, we have extreme barriers to entry. The four main barriers to entry are government restrictions, which prevent new firms from entering the industry and competing, the control of a key resource that's used in the production process, network externalities, where goods become more useful the more people use them, like the iPhone, and natural monopoly, where the way average total cost decreases as you increase production. So naturally, you'll end up with one firm buying out all these other firms because it's so much cheaper as you expand. So the first way the government restricts entry is patents and copyrights. So if there's new products, like pharmaceutical drugs, they're frequently granted patents. So you spend all this time researching and developing this new product. It takes a lot of time and a lot of money. So what the government allows is that these companies apply for a patent, the exclusive right to use that product for 20 years after the date it's filed. So it gives them this market power. It gives them a monopoly in the short run, or I guess for 20 years. So they're able to recoup the cost that it took to develop these. So in the pharmaceutical industry, patents are very important. While there's a lot of reforms that are necessary, at least in my opinion, for the pharmaceutical industry, it's still necessary to have these, or else firms would be unable to recoup the amount of money they spend trying to develop these new drugs. If they're unable to recoup their R&D costs, what's going to happen is they're going to spend a lot less money trying to come up with new drugs, and we're not going to see new pharmaceuticals being developed. So we need this market power, at least for some period of time, in order to encourage them to produce these goods. But what causes for consumers is increased price, at least in the short run. And the same basic thing for copyrights, but these cover, instead of physical products, they cover creative works, for books, movies, artwork, stuff like that. The second type of government restriction on entry is public franchises. So the government basically designates that the firm is the only one that can provide a good or service. Anyone else is barred legally from doing it. So these often exist in electricity or water markets. They're far more common in places like Europe and the United States. In Europe, trains are run by governments over there, whereas they're run by private companies in the U.S. But one example in the U.S. is the Postal Service. So to deliver first-class mail, like letters, only the Postal Service is allowed to do that. FedEx, UPS can deliver packages all they want, but they can't deliver actual mail. And there's Newman from Seinfeld promising to deliver Jerry's package on time. All right, so we'll end there for today. Remember, there's no class on Friday.